Privilege is on the table. For some, it's a tasty dish. It smells so good, we can't wait to tuck in and relish the feast. For others, it's a toxic stench of toxic sludge. We're gagging on the fumes and waiting for someone to please, just take it off the table again. Why for so many of us is it so awkward to talk about privilege? Why for so many of us is it so difficult to acknowledge we might have privilege, let alone embrace the idea of losing it? And indeed, why is losing it so scary when it just might be the best thing we could do for ourselves, our relationships, and the planet? I'm a writer, a teacher, a filmmaker, and I research what happens to people at the point where they lose some of their privileges, what I call privilege loss. Now, what interests me about privilege is that it's the often neglected flip side of social justice campaigns. You know, if you've got a campaign for greater social equality, well, if it's to any degree successful and gains some of its intents, that relative balance between privilege and disadvantage shifts. When this happens, some will relatively gain privilege, but others will relatively lose it. So what happens to people at that point of privilege loss? Well, some might say, hey, forget those people. They had their time in the sun. Let's sit back and watch them suffer. I don't want to sit back and watch them suffer for two reasons. One, they're us. As I'm going to argue today, we're all connected in privilege. But two, if we do forget those people and their privilege loss, we risk facing the worst consequences of it, where people get angry, fearful, resentful, and look for someone to blame. Now, I grew up reasonably aware of privilege. My parents were both feminists, interested in social inequalities. When they split up, one became rich and the other poor, and I got some idea of the pros and cons of both sides. When they died, I got some idea of loss. I went on to become an academic, and I wrote a book about inequality in healthcare. Now, my mum always warned me, son, don't become an academic. She'd worked as a secretary for some and found them all to be egomaniacs. Something about being told all day that you're an expert gives an overinflated sense of self. Well, I didn't listen. But it's only been in recent years that I've come to appreciate the massive role that privilege plays in all of this. See, at this stage in my life, I lead a double life. Half of my time I live here in Auckland, a global city where I'm widely recognized for possessing many lines of privilege, for being white, male, straight, employed. I mean, I get well paid to research privilege loss. You know, the irony's not lost on me. But the other half of my life, I live with my wife's tribe, an Indigenous community in a small isolated town in northern Canada, where very different privilege rules apply. While in the city, my voice is sought out, I'm given platforms to speak, and the PhD by my name heralds my status and my expertise as a teacher and a researcher. In Indigenous Arctic Canada, expertise isn't measured by the letters after your name. And believe me, no one needs to know the opinion of a doctor of media studies when it's minus 30 degrees outside, the generator stopped working, and a pack of wolves just ate your neighbor's dog. So what interested me, though, wasn't that the rules were different. I knew that much going in. What fascinated me was the physical feeling of adjusting to the most minor of privilege changes. Relatively losing speaking rights, for instance, for an entitled white male who lectures for a living, felt like a burning injustice. When I wasn't allowed to speak as much as I was used to, it felt so unfair. And I had to put so much effort in to forcing down this feeling of indignation, lest I start blurting out inappropriate things at inappropriate times. And I thought, why is this so hard? And if it's so hard for me, is it hard for other people too? And I looked on the news and saw around the world and saw that, yeah, apparently this is hard for a lot of people, adjusting to privilege loss. So hence this project, to try and understand the loss a little better and maybe develop some tools to help us embrace it with more dignity. So what are we talking about here? What is this privilege? Well, I'm a social scientist, so let's social science this. The word literally means private law, privis plus leg. Now, some have interpreted this, well, what does that mean? That means a rule for some and some for others. That means advantages for some and not for others. That means access to resources for some and not for others. Some have taken this very literally and only interpreted it as meaning what the law says one can and can't do, legal privileges. But in the social sciences, we know that society is governed by much more than law alone. The unwritten rules, the informal rules, the norms, the etiquettes, these govern our lives and these involve privilege and unfair advantages too. There's no law, for example, that says women can't get paid as much as men. Some have also interpreted privilege as only meaning white privilege, often in a United States sense of black-white racial dynamics. And look, white privilege is real, there's no doubt about that. colonialism, the triangular slave trade, the exporting of European values around the world have created the conditions we now live in, and they are conditions that privilege whiteness. But the growing field of privilege studies looks at unfair advantages in a much wider sense, going beyond ethnicity to look too at class, age, gender, sexual orientation, employment status, housing status, physical health, able-bodiedness, mental health, languages spoken, religion, and so forth, and looks at the unfair and unshared privileges in these too. One of the most interesting things about privilege is that those who have it often don't know they have it. It's invisible to them. Peggy McIntosh famously called privilege an invisible backpack, full of passports and maps and visas and blank checks that you can cash in at any time, but which you were meant to remain oblivious about. Others have called privilege the wind at your back, where just like going for a bike ride with the wind at your back, you often don't realize it's there until you turn around and start trying to ride into it. I like to think of privilege as an invisible door person, someone who opens the door for me at certain times and then closes it in the face of others, or sometimes closes it in my face. Now, there's been a lot written about privilege in recent years, both in the academy and in the media. And there's a tendency in this commentary to talk about it in terms of people who have privilege and then people who don't. And I want to reject this binary. I don't think it makes so much sense. You see, who we are, all of us, who we are is complex and complicated. We're all made up of so many different identity categories, our age, our ethnicity, and so on. I like to think of us all as complex machines made up of many levers. His age, his body type, his religion, his language is spoken. Now, whether or not that lever is turned to privilege or not depends on the structure you find yourself in. If the structure is patriarchy, the lever will be turned to privilege if it's male. If the structure is heteronormativity, it will be there at heterosexual. But here's the thing, the structures change, and they change in space and in time, where the rules governing privilege in this room or an inner city boardroom are very different to those in a small isolated town in northern Canada. And in that town, the rules in the speaker's circle, the sharing circle, will be very different to those in the kitchen. But they also change in time, where the rules governing gender in New Zealand right now are very different to how they were 30 years ago and very different to how they will be in the future. The trick is to work out what the actual structure is, to work out where the levers are turned, and can we find someone who has every single lever turned to privilege or indeed to disadvantage in every possible context? I don't think they could exist. But this isn't some free-for-all way of saying that everyone's equal in privilege. Far from it. Privileges are not equal, not in how they impact human well-being or human misery. The privilege of speaking first, last, and most often in a business meeting is not the same as the privilege to not be put in jail because of your sexual orientation, or to not be taken away from your family as a child because of your race. Privileges are not equal, and the trick is always to work out what the context is. So what happens when that context changes and a lever is turned to loss? What happens at the point of privilege loss? Well, the first thing to note, there's no real objectivity when it comes to thinking about our privilege loss. How we feel about our privileges relates to how we perceive them, not how they actually are. You know, often the loudest complaints about privilege loss occur well before any actual loss happens, when loss is a hypothetical possibility on a distant horizon. And yes, us angry white males complain very loudly about this. But why is this? Well, look, for many of us, the moment of facing the prospect of losing a privilege is also the first moment of realizing that that privilege even existed. If you're used to your entire life of someone opening the door for you and then they stop, it feels unfair. It feels like it's getting slammed in your face. And you might ask, seriously? How could you not realize someone was standing there opening the door for you all this time? It seems so obvious to everybody else. Or to be fair, we're actually conditioned to not see the invisible door person. We're conditioned to not see our privileges, and we're conditioned to see unequal privilege as normal. Hollywood movies, for example, normalize an idea of male dominance and female subservience. Consumer advertising normalizes an ideal body type and an ideal of beauty. Our physical cities normalize the able-bodied and the youthful, and our mainstream education and mainstream media systems normalize colonizer culture over indigenous ones. Now, there's exceptions to all of that, of course, but the dominant tendencies are clear. So with all that going on, hey, it's understandable why some would internalize the idea of unequal privileges, whether they benefit them or whether in fact they don't. But look, going even further, there are two ideologies that are circulated so often in Western societies that we've come to see them not even as ideological and just as the way things are. And they're two ideologies that make it very, very difficult to see and appreciate privilege. The ideology of meritocracy and the ideology of individualism. These tell us that not only are we all unique individuals whose categories do not define us, but also that we have all equal opportunities in life, and thus our achievements are the fair fruits of our efforts and skills. Well, these are beautiful ideas in themselves, but when seen through a privilege lens, they're complete fantasies. And that's a hard pill for many to swallow. If you see, the invisible door person, they're forcing us to ask, hey, if much of what I've achieved in life was due to my category and not to my individuality, am I really as capable as what I always thought? Am I as worthy? Am I as ethical? Am I actually much, much more average? The concept of privilege has very real impact for how we see ourselves. So it's understandable why we often struggle so much with the idea. And you know, because of all of this, we have developed many, many powerful strategies for evading and deflecting privilege and its challenges to us. I call these privilege deflection, the art of evading accountability. This is a type of mental martial art, very well developed, and it's full of moves to deflect perceived attacks on your privilege. The first move is a simple one, denial. Deny privilege exists for you and for other people. It's worked very well to delay accountability on climate change, and it works for privilege too. The second move is to justify the inequality. This one acknowledges that society is unequal, but it justifies it as the natural order. Statements like, societies need hierarchies in order to function. Women are great, they're just not as strong as men. And poor people had their chance, they're just lazy. Articulate these, naturalizing the inequality. This feeds really easily into another strategy, delegitimize the non-privileged. Have you ever noticed in society how many powerful people dedicate so much energy to delegitimizing and disparaging the already disadvantaged? Ethnic minorities, migrants, welfare dependents. I mean, why? What threat are they? What threat are we to the powerful? Well, the logic goes like this. If the disadvantaged are unworthy, then inequality is justified. And if inequality is justified, then no one needs to take ethical account of your own privileges. Privilege has been deflected, intact. But look, there's deflection moves for everybody. Even if you're interested in creating a more equal society, there are still some ways that you too can evade accountability for your privilege. One is to insist on absolute comfort when discussing your privilege. If you're feeling at all awkward about the privilege conversation, the conversation must end. Your safety is paramount. Privilege intact. But my favorite deflection technique is privilege solidarity. This is a subtle one, but it might be familiar to people. This is one where we comfort people against threats to our privilege, comfort the similarly privileged. It might be familiar to people who are deeply worried about climate change, but also fly on planes a lot. You know that moment you're flying on a plane, you don't know the person next to you, and you start chatting and you're getting on really, really well, but then after a while you start talking about climate change and it gets really awkward because you're flying on a plane? You need to find a way to comfort each other very quickly, to reassure each other that you're one of the good guys. Plastic cups? A single-use plastic cup on this airline? That's disgusting, my friend, I know. I recycle, you recycle, we recycle. We are one of the good guys. This is privilege solidarity. It's the privilege fist pump. And in this example, it does for the privilege of flying what the locker room chat does for toxic masculinity. And we have many other moves, and you know, it's understandable. You see, addressing our privileges, let alone losing them, it's scary. It just might mean changing our view of ourselves. It might mean offending people we love. It might mean rejection from our communities. And let's be real. Privileges bring material rewards. How comfortable are we really to give up all that cool stuff? Well, as cool as all that stuff is, I'd like to argue that the benefits of privilege loss far outweigh the costs. In one of the 20 most watched TED Talks of all time, Brené Brown tells us that meaningful connection with other people is the most important part of leading a worthwhile life, and that vulnerability is a key pathway to connection. Well, privilege blocks connection with other people, and it builds an insulating cocoon around vulnerability. And look, if relationships aren't your priority, but you do like being right about stuff, privilege is worth losing too. You see, if your analysis of society and of yourself doesn't cater in all those informal ways that unshared advantages work, it's just not going to be very accurate. But look, I don't want to give the wrong impression today. I don't want to give the impression that I've got this privilege loss stuff down, because believe me, I don't. I'm trying to overcome a lifetime of entitlement, and I'm constantly failing in it. Falling down, chewing up the scenery, disgracing myself, and insulting people. And all I can do is get up, try and own it, and do a little bit better. But I want to do a lot better, and I want you to help me. You see, I'm collecting stories about privilege loss in order to find a way to deal with this better. So if you have a story of your own privilege loss, or you know someone, come and find me and tell me. Share it with me, because I want to hear it. I'm betting that in our collective wisdom, we have all the tools we need to embrace the loss with dignity, fairness, and courage. And this isn't an ethical question. This is a necessity. You see, there's one privilege that all of us in this room right now share, and that's the privilege to consume more than our fair share of the earth's resources. And that's a privilege we do need to lose. But I think in losing it, we're going to find something much more precious. So let's work together to manage smoothly our transition to a more equal world. Let's lose the privilege and gain the connection. Thank you.